It's great to see everyone tonight. Good evening. Welcome to tonight's, thank you. Welcome to tonight's Gaiety Institute for the Liberal Arts all-campus lecture series sponsored by the Sociology and Anthropology Department, Communication Studies, Political Science, and one secret department that elected to remain unnamed. My name is Blake Kent. I'm an assistant professor of sociology, and tonight's lecture will feature a talk by our guest, followed by a time of Q&A, and we'll conclude at 8:30, so you have an anticipation of what's happening. The first time I heard the name of our guest, I was in a hallway at Baylor University chatting with a few other graduate students, and the faculty in the room know that a common topic for grad students to chat about is how many publications you need to get a job. We're pretty practical. Is it one? Is it 5 now? Oh, goodness, hope it's not 10. But it was in that conversation that I started to hear these wild stories about this bionic man named Sam Perry, who was publishing articles regularly as we were publishing tweets. Dr. Perry is arguably one of the most prolific and widely recognized sociologists of religion writing today. He's authored or co-authored 4 books and over 100 peer-reviewed articles since finishing his PhD at the University of Chicago in 2015. Also trained at Dallas Theological Seminary, his work sits at the intersection of conservative Christianity, American politics, race, sexuality, and families. His co-authored book, Taking America Back for God, Christian Nationalism in the United States, was the book of the year at the Society for the Scientific Study of Religion, and it won the Award of Merit in the Politics and Public Life category in Christianity Today's 2021 Book Awards. His most recent co-authored book, The Flag and the Cross, White Christian Nationalism and the Threat to American Democracy, released just last Friday. The topic of Christian nationalism raises many questions about who we are as Christians, what we are meant to believe, how we are to relate to the political structures that we both shape and shape us. Dr. Perry's work over the last 5 years has been incredibly important in helping us come to terms with what Christian nationalism is, how it correlates with demographic, social, political, and behavioral variables. As both a researcher and a public-facing sociologist, Dr. Perry doesn't just publish academic work. He regularly contributes to national media outlets, podcasts, documentary films, and recently he advised members of the U.S. House of Representatives on this topic. It's almost impossible to engage in a conversation on Christian nationalism without referencing Dr. Perry and his work. We're very fortunate to have him with us on campus tonight to shed light on this crucial topic on contemporary Christianity in the United States. So please welcome me in joining Dr. Sam Perry.
My goodness, what an introduction. I don't think my own mother would have given me such generous words, so thank you so much. It is a delight to be here, to join you in this time, and I'm so grateful that you would invite me out, and what a privilege to be able to share research here at Camp Westmont, one of the prettiest campuses I've ever been on in my life. The whole time today, I was just walking around thinking people live here, people learn here apparently. I can only imagine how difficult that must be with such a beautiful campus, and yet I've been able to meet some faculty and some students, and I'm thoroughly convinced that you get serious about research here. Really bright students and bright faces, and I'm excited to share with you some work that I've been doing. So what I want to talk to you about tonight is something that we are seriously facing as a country, but we are also seriously facing as Christians. So I speak to you I want to disclose a little bit about myself. I'm not just a sociologist, but I'm a fellow Christian. Became a Christian when I was 18 years old through a college ministry. I was discipled through that campus ministry and ended up working for that campus ministry. Met my wife through that campus ministry, fell in love with working with college students and wanted college students to be the center of my life. I went to seminary afterwards at Dallas Theological Seminary, and quickly thereafter decided I wanted to learn about sociology and share that with the world. So I was fortunate enough to get into a good graduate program at the University of Chicago, and University of Oklahoma is where I've been ever since. One of the things that's always fascinated me about American Christianity is how it often becomes indistinguishably wed from aspects of American culture. That has been true of our faith historically throughout a nation's history. Oftentimes it has been inextricably connected with race, and in many ways still is. I believe we have found, and we are documenting over the past few years, it is inextricably bound with aspects of nation, who we are as a people. And I think that is sometimes for the better when we understand it in more of a civil religious kind of term. When we think about God blessing America with the prosperity that we have as a nation that tries to live up to its values of equality and justice and mercy. And I believe it is for ill when we use that to exclude others from the national conversation or from participation in civic democracy. And I want to talk to you about that because I think it is something serious. We find that Christian nationalism is often the leading predictor of anti-democratic, exclusionary, authoritarian, and even violent attitudes. We saw those on display on January 6th. We believe that in our book, The Flag and the Cross, we talk about what took place on January 6th is not necessarily, certainly was extreme in the violence that we saw, but it wasn't fringe in that the kind of ideology it was displaying. In fact, it was better understood as an eruption of forces that were building under the ground for a long, long time and could explode again. And so I want to talk about what is leading towards that and how we can have conversations to diffuse that kind of pressure. So what I want to argue today, and this is, I'll keep it real simple. I want to be direct and I want to be data-driven. I'm a social scientist primarily. I have training in the New Testament and I have training in theology, and yet I want to come to you arguing as a social scientist with data as my only evidence. That white Christian nationalism in particular is everybody's problem. It's something that should concern us all, liberal or conservative, Christian or secular, because it is authoritarian, it is anti-democratic, and it is conspiratorial. And I believe the current political trends are worsening its impact on our democracy, and that's what I want to show you today. So first, let's talk about what is Christian nationalism. How do we define that? Well, in our first book, Taking America Back for God, my co-author Andrew Whitehead and I define Christian nationalism as an ideology that idealizes and advocates a fusion of American civic life with a very particular kind of Christianity. Let's break that definition down a little bit. First, I mean an ideology. What I mean by this is a system of ideas and ideals that form the basis of one's political theory or a practice. You could call it a theology, but it doesn't have to be something that is necessarily from God or from the Bible, but it's an ideology, a theory that unifies one's basis of political theory and practice, that idealizes and advocates. Here we break two parts of this definition down. So it idealizes and advocates. In our new book, The Flag and the Cross, we talk about Christian nationalism as both a deep story and a vision. It is an understanding. It imagines this fusion with America and Christianity as a sacred myth, something that has always been since its founding. You've heard cliched statements that we are founded on biblical principles, that we are founded on Christian values. And that story is complex. And anybody who tells you about the history of America and its relationship with Christianity and does not acknowledge that that is a complex story, that they are either completely secular or completely Christian, I believe is trying to sell you something, because it is quite a complex story, with certain founders believing some things, arguing with other founders who believed other things, and citing different documents in their stead. So that is a complex story, but Christian nationalism would like to argue that that is a simple story in which we have a sacred and mythic past, one with a tightly bound relationship with the Christian God, but also it fights to institutionalize that vision in the future, to realize that now. So we have a deep story and a vision of what could be. And it's a very particular kind of Christianity. When I talk about Christianity mixed with nation, Christian nationalism, I don't mean orthodoxy. I don't mean somebody who has made Jesus the Lord and Savior of their life. I don't mean somebody who wants to live out Christ's mandate to love God and love people. What I'm really referring to is an ethnocultural order, when Christianity becomes code language for people like us. So how do we measure Christian nationalism? As a social scientist, what we always try to do is we try to do something called operationalization. We try to operationalize this definition. How do we measure it, and how do we indicate how pervasive it is, and how do we isolate its association with various kinds of outcomes and attitudes and behaviors. So the way we do this in our new book, The Flag and the Cross, we draw upon research on Christian nationalism that has gone on before. We utilize a scale, but what we're trying to do is we're trying to capture both this deep story and the vision of what Christian nationalism is. So two measures that we use seven items in a scale. And so we ask Americans in all of our national surveys to indicate their level of agreement from 0 equals completely disagree all the way to 4 equals strongly agree. We ask them their level of agreement with 7 statements. The first 2 help us to isolate that deep story. I consider the founding documents like the Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution to be divinely inspired. That'd be a pretty good indicator of Christian nationalism, I think, if you think the founding documents are literally inspired by God, similar to our Bible. The success of the United States is part of God's plan. Now, you might say that you affirm that in a Calvinistic way, right? Like that isn't it everything in God's plan generally? No, usually people who affirm this have in mind that we have a special relationship with God, that God likes us the best, that America is where God pays attention. All right? So we have a deep story of a special connection with the Christian God. We also try to isolate this idea of a vision, what America should be, not just ideas about America's past, but what America could and should be in the future. The federal government should declare the United States a Christian nation. Again, pretty explicit statement. Somebody who scores higher on that variable, pretty clear, wants us to be a Christian nation, so Christian nationalism would be a good descriptor of what that person believes. The federal government should advocate Christian values. The federal government should enforce a strict separation of church and state. We reverse code that so that people who disagree with that score higher. In other words, they don't want a separation of church and state. They want those two things to be tightly fused. The federal government should allow the display of religious symbols in public spaces. The federal government should allow prayer in public schools. Now, you might look at some of those questions and say, well, I'd kind of agree with that, right? Like that idea of prayer in public schools or religious symbols in public spaces, I confess, I would be ambivalent about that, maybe depending on what you mean by that, right? Like I want my child to be able to wear a cross around her neck in a public space, and I want my kid to be able to pray in a public school. Usually people who strongly affirm these statements, though, what we see in this scale that we use, we see a good level of consistency. In other words, people tend to know what we're asking about. In this, they know we're asking about kind of culture war issues of whether school or prayer should be like mandated in public school, or you can have teacher-led prayer in public school, or whether religious symbols in public spaces isn't just kind of whether somebody could wear a hijab, but usually people understand that to mean something like the 10 Commandments on the courthouse or crosses on state seals, something that indicates more of a connection between the state and the church. And so what we do is we add all of these scores up together into a scale, ranging from 0 all the way to 28. And so people who score higher on this scale score higher on Christian nationalism. People who score lower on this scale usually reject Christian nationalism. Something I want to be clear about, though, as I'm talking about what Christian nationalism is, you'll notice that I very rarely, and I don't at all if I can avoid it or if I can remember to avoid it, I rarely ever refer to people as Christian nationalists. I don't like calling people that. I don't like saying white Christian nationalists do this, think this, you're one of them. That kind of language I find is unhelpful. That's about as helpful as calling somebody a fascist or calling somebody a Nazi or a racist, right? It really shuts down the conversation. I much rather prefer to talk about this as an ideology that somebody can embrace more or less. It's a spectrum. And so I can talk about how somebody is scoring higher or is more likely to affirm Christian nationalist ideology. That way we just talk about it as a belief system, as a set of ideas and values that people can adhere to, they can reject, they can be right in the middle. And in fact, we actually find in our studies, we find that most Americans are right there in the middle. They're actually not polarized. So when we talk about how Christian nationalism, the distribution of this variable, this scale that we call Christian nationalism, we don't see people on the far left and the far right. We've seen most people in the middle. That indicates that most Americans are kind of ambivalent about this. And that's probably because most Americans fall in this line of friendly towards Christianity. Most of them are Christians, and most of them have an idea of like, you know what, prayer in public schools, religious symbols, those sound like good things. Christian values, I'd like more of that in politics. But they are uncomfortable with saying, hey, no separation of church and state, and declaring a Christian nation, and this really tight connection. And they're also uncomfortable, because most Americans are not atheists, most Americans are not radically secular. They're also uncomfortable with strongly disagreeing with all of that. Most Americans tend to be right there in the middle. But what we find is the more Americans embrace Christian nationalism along this scale, and this is what I'll show you in spades tonight, the more we find that their attitudes are associated with other noxious kind of political values and behavior, including anti-democratic values, including authoritarian violence, including conspiratorial beliefs, and even the threat of political violence in the future. So we'll dive in. First, you've noticed in my book up here, we talk about white Christian nationalism. So it's in the title. Sometimes people talk about Christian nationalism. Other times we talk about white Christian nationalism. We are actually moving as a discipline to try to refer to white Christian nationalism rather than just blanket Christian nationalism, and I'll show you why. It actually operates very differently depending on whether or not you identify with one racial group or another. And this is because, and I'll indicate this to you in a second with some experimental data, religion in the United States is fundamentally racialized. So let me say that again. Religion in the United States is fundamentally racialized. It's shaped by our racial identities, and it's shaped by our racial experiences and our status in that social structure that we call race. Let me give you an example of how this works out with Christian nationalism research, though. So, this is the predicted percentage of white and black Americans who believe that whites face the most discrimination. So we asked Americans, we gave them a list of who experiences the most discrimination. Asian Americans, black Americans, white Americans, trans people, lesbian or gay Americans, Muslims, atheists. And this is the predicted percentage after we've controlled for all of these other factors: political partisanship, political ideology, education, where you live in the country. And so we looked at the score of Christian nationalism. So Christian nationalism is across the bottom of the scale. And this is the predicted percentage. So again, after we have teased out all of these other controls. What we see is that as Christian nationalism increases, white Americans are basically in a linear fashion, become consistently more likely to say, yes, white Americans are the most discriminated against population in the United States. Now notice in this, let's look at the scale again. Do you see anything in there about race at all? Right, not one question. Like, we don't even hint at it. We have no questions about race in our Christian nationalism scale, and yet, the more white Americans affirm Christian nationalist ideology, the more likely they are to believe that whites themselves are discriminated against. And yet, African Americans, black Americans, the more they affirm Christian nationalism, they don't do anything. They don't change at all in their attitudes. Why? Well, that would suggest that for white Americans, Christian language, Christian heritage, Christian values, Christian nation, that kind of language is fundamentally racialized. When they affirm those kinds of questions, it makes them think white. It makes them think people like us, people like me, my nation, my heritage, my kinds of values. Let me give you another example. Same pattern. This is the predicted percentage who agree with the statement, reports of police brutality are exaggerated by the media. We see as Christian nationalism increases, white Americans are basically, again, same pattern, linearly, more likely to say, you know what, the media exaggerates discrimination against black Americans. But black Americans hardly change at all as they affirm Christian nationalism. Why? Well, because for black Americans, that Christian language is not racialized the way it is for white Americans. It doesn't mean the same thing. Again, the language of Christianity, Christian identity, Christian values, Christian nation is racialized. Let me give you one more example. The predicted percentage of white and black Americans who agree that the best way to stop a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun. So we're getting into a little bit of attitudes towards certain kinds of violence, permissible violence. We see as white Americans affirm Christian nationalism, they become increasingly more likely to say that, yes, best way to stop a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun. As black Americans increase, again, we don't see much change. This would all suggest that in the United States, Christian language is racialized. It means people like me, especially for white Americans. And when white Americans read that language, they think nostalgically. They look back to a time where people like me had the cultural power, had the political influence, and had the say, and they want to go back to that time. When black Americans affirm our measures of Christian nationalism, they don't think back to a time when the right people were in power and they had all the cultural influence and they had all the say. They don't think nostalgically. They tend to more think aspirationally, the kind of nation that we could be but never were, right? Like the kind of holding America to account for the values that it claimed to follow all along. But I want to go a little bit further than this. Something I've been getting into the last few months, or actually the last year, in fact, has been experimental data. And we've been trying to get to the bottom of this idea of religion being fundamentally racialized in the United States. I think we've discovered some really neat things. So one of the things that we tried to do recently is we did a little survey. And what we did is we had Americans indicate who is truly American. And we did it with a little experiment using circles, or a little survey using circles. So we had a little implicit association test. What we did is we gave them a group of circles, or we gave them circles, and on each question, we gave them one that the smaller circle was some identity. So it was being white, being black, being Muslim, being atheist. And the larger circle is what it means to be true American. And we had them rate from numbers 1 to 5, giving them those pictures, which one came closest to the relationship between those two. So if they picked 1, then they meant being white was completely outside of being truly American, that they didn't think they were connected at all. If they indicated 5, total fusion, that being white was right smack in the middle of being truly American. Does that make sense? Okay, and so we gave them all those things for like Muslim, atheist, black, white Christian, black Christian, all of those different combinations as well. And here's what we found. We found the 3 most fused identities with American identity were white Christian, and Christian. And this was a sample of white Christians that we pulled from, it was a random sample of white Christians that we pulled from a larger study. So among white Christians, they found white Christian, and Christian were basically identical with one another, so they were interchangeable. And they were significantly more likely to be rated as truly American. In other words, what comes to mind when they think of a true American? Now, this is also interesting, though. Notice that Christian is no less American than being white Christian or white, right? Like they are indistinguishable statistically. But for some reason, being a black Christian is less American than being a Christian. Notice how this goes down? By just indicating that this is a black Christian, it actually made them less American. What's happening? Well, it suggests that when we just gave this group of white Christians the label Christian, that implied white for them. And so by qualifying it, by saying it's a black Christian, it actually made them less American. Same thing for white. Notice that white over here is no more or less significantly American than white Christian or Christian, but notice that white by itself is way more American than white Muslim or white atheist. What's going on there? Well, for this group of white Christians, white, if we didn't specify, was also Christian. Christian was implied there. And so what this suggests is that in the minds of many white Christians, in particular, whiteness and Christianity are fused together, especially in what it means to be truly American, but in a way that seems interchangeable relative to other identities. So once again, I think we're demonstrating that for many white Christian Americans, the kinds of audiences that might respond to Christian nationalist ideology, being Christian, being white, are more truly American, but they do so in a way that is largely interchangeable with one another. So let's get to the data. White Christian nationalism is everyone's problem because it is authoritarian, anti-democratic, and conspiratorial. This is actually really easy to show. We've been collecting survey data for the past 2 years in several waves, and in those waves of survey data over COVID, over the 2020 election, past the Capitol insurrection. Our latest wave was in August 2021, so we have been collecting this data all through really tumultuous and interesting times and been able to ask questions about modern phenomena, things that are going on recently in our history. We find that Christian nationalism is associated with all of these things, primarily among white Americans. So let me give you some examples. We find that as Christian nationalism increases, as people move across our score from largely rejecting Christian nationalism all the way to largely embracing it, they are far more likely in basically a linear way. And again, everything I'm showing you is after control. So I have controlled statistically for political partisanship. In other words, I'm not just showing you being a Republican. I'm not just showing you being a political conservative. I'm not just showing you education or income or region of the country or being an evangelical, controlled for all that, or church attendance, controlled for that. We have removed statistically the effects of those influences in order to isolate the association of Christian nationalism. And what we find is the more white Americans affirm Christian nationalism, they are strongly more likely to say the best way to stop a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun, basically 90% at the highest levels of Christian nationalism. The biggest problem with the death penalty is that we don't use it enough. Authorities should be able to use any means necessary in order to keep law and order. And if national security is at risk, I support the use of torture. Now, you might say, maybe you're in this room right now and you say, well, I agree with those statements, or I agree with some of those statements. And do these statements seem so outrageous? Not really. They're not so outlandish that the kind of things that you might hear, the kind of things that you might even agree with, some of them. And yet together, taken together, a strong agreement with all of these, I think points us in the direction of people who are not only okay with political violence being used to stop deviant threats or even the possible threat, but a strong support of it. You favor it. You favor that kind of violence to be able to stop the people that you feel like are threats to order, potential risks to national security, or potential risks to the kind of order that you wish to establish in a society, right? Like bad guys with guns. In other words, you see the world as a place of violence, and really it's a matter of who has the violence and who has the right to use that kind of violence. We also see that Christian nationalism is associated with anti-democratic attitudes. I'll just go all the way down to the bottom, or I'll start from the top. As Christian nationalism increases, we find that, and by the way, we asked these questions. 3 of these questions we asked before the October 2020 election. So this isn't post talk of stolen election. This is before the 2020 election, so before there was any kind of debate about whether or not there was voter fraud going on. This was October 2020, and we find that white Americans who affirm Christian nationalism were already more likely to say, we make it too easy to vote already. That they would support civics tests in order to vote. In other words, like they would support a hypothetical law saying you have to pass a basic civics test in order to vote. That's actually one we pulled from Jim Crow. We just kind of randomly pulled that one and said, like, you know what would be something that somebody would have affirmed during Jim Crow? Like, yeah, passing a civics test in order to vote. That you have to prove yourself worthy and know enough. That you would revoke the votes of certain felons for life. We call that lifelong disenfranchisement, and that is actually not something that is legal in the vast majority of states. It's only legal in certain states. And yet, white Americans who affirm Christian nationalism would be far more likely to say, yes, I would revoke the voting rights of certain felons for life. In August 2021, we asked this question. This is the one at the bottom. We just asked Americans to indicate whether they think voting is a right or a privilege. It's an easy question, right? Is voting a right or a privilege? We found that the vast majority of Americans say that voting is a right. And they're correct to do so. Voting is a right. Voting is a right that shall not be infringed. It's something that we dare not violate. It is democracy, and it is what makes participation in our society possible. It is your right as a citizen. And yet we found that the more Americans affirm our measures of Christian nationalist ideology, the more likely they are to see voting as less of a right and more of a privilege. To the point, look at the very bottom of there. At the highest scores of our Christian nationalism scale, white Americans are the majority of them, are more likely to say that voting is a privilege, not a right. What does that mean? Well, if it's a privilege, it's something I can limit. If it's a privilege, it's something I can take away. But if it's a right, it's something that I have to allow you to have. So what all of this does is paints together a picture. The more Americans affirm Christian nationalist, white Americans affirm Christian nationalist ideology, the more likely they are to affirm anti-democratic attitudes, that they would want to limit access to the vote, that they already think we make it too easy to vote, even before the 2020 election, that voting should be a privilege and not a right. What about conspiratorial thinking? Here's where it gets kind of fun and weird. So obviously, this should be intuitive, that the more white Americans affirm Christian nationalism, maybe not to this extreme, this might surprise you, but the more white Americans affirm Christian nationalism, the more likely they are to believe the election was stolen from Donald Trump. We look at the axis over there. At the highest levels of our Christian nationalism scale, over 90% believe the election was stolen from Donald Trump. That was actually in August 2021, so 7 months after the election, or not even 7 months, nearly a year. I was thinking the inauguration. Nearly a year after 2020, or November 2020, the more white Americans affirm Christian nationalism at the highest levels, over 90% believe that the election was stolen. What about roughly 7 months after the Capitol, or 8 months after the Capitol insurrection? We see at the bottom, Antifa and Black Lives Matter were mixed in with the crowd and started the violence. Outside attitude, same pattern. So the more you affirm Christian nationalism, the more likely you are to say, no, it wasn't anybody. It was Black Lives Matter. It was Antifa. They were the ones who are to blame. Let's look at some other ones. That one, the gray, the light gray, the COVID vaccines themselves have killed hundreds of people. Now we're getting a little bit dangerous, right? And these patterns all the way, by the way, hold true. I don't have the chart up here. These hold true, like these same patterns are just like you would expect with who is more likely to be vaccinated and to get the vaccine. The more white Americans affirm Christian nationalism, the less likely they are to get vaccinated, the more likely they are to say, I don't plan on getting vaccinated at all and you can't make me. And why? Well, we see this is connected with conspiratorial thinking about the vaccines. The vaccines themselves have killed hundreds of people. Not COVID, but vaccines. And lastly, this is QAnon. So sometimes, I'll just be honest, sometimes you ask these questions on surveys, and you think, this is a wasted question. Nobody's going to agree to this. What kind of insane, like these cost money. I can't believe I'm wasting money asking this question on this survey. Who is actually going to affirm this? And lo and behold, it turns out that a lot of people want to affirm this. So this is the primary QAnon conspiracy theory that there is, and the full question says this: the government, the media, and the financial world are run by a group of elite leaders who run a pedophile ring and are engaged in child sex trafficking. We find that the more white Americans affirm Christian nationalism, the more likely they are to affirm that, to almost to the point of 50% at the highest levels. Think about that. Like, you could almost make up just some kind of crazy like conspiracy theory. Like, it would be difficult to come up with one that is more far-fetched. And yet we find that as more Americans affirm, white Americans in particular, affirm Christian nationalist ideology, the more likely they are to embrace not only talk of a stolen election, not only completely disproven belief that Antifa and Black Lives Matter started the Capitol insurrection, or the belief that COVID vaccines have killed hundreds of people, but they also subscribe to QAnon conspiracy. Where does all this point to? Why is this a problem? Well, here's why. I think what this does, combine all of these things, the idea of anti-democratic attitudes, commitment to authoritarian means of like control, even to the point of violence and conspiratorial thinking. And we see these kinds of trends, and this is where it gets a little bit worrisome. These are also connected to QAnon a little bit, and so you see a correlation with those kinds of responses, but in a linear way, we see that the more white Americans affirm Christian nationalist ideology, the more likely they are to believe that there is a storm coming soon that will sweep away elites in power and restore rightful leaders. And because things have gotten so far off track, true American patriots may have to resort to physical violence in order to save our country. Now, does that mean that they will resort to physical violence? Not necessarily. Usually that happens under like a combination of like ideal circumstances. Those of you who have a sociologist background or have taken sociology classes may understand the social dynamics of mobs. We tend to lose ourselves in mobs in large crowds, especially if stoked by a charismatic or loud or angry leader. If we're swept up in the emotion of it all, if we feel aggrieved in a combination of violent rhetoric, and we're kind of lost in the swell, just like in a sports crowd or like in some kind of situation, it could lead to violence. And I think this kind of underlying ideology is supporting the possibility of that kind of thing. So not only do I feel like it is authoritarian, anti-democratic, and conspiratorial, but I believe it is associated with the potential for violence like we witnessed on January 6th. But even more problematic than this, you could argue that like this underlying ideology is one thing, and maybe people wouldn't act on it. But we are also finding that current political trends are worsening its impact on our democracy. So first I need to explain to you how political polarization works. So within the last few decades, the talk of America has been that we are a polarized society, that we exist in that, and we are, if you were to think of it in terms of a picture, you would think of it as two groups of people that are on opposite sides of the spectrum, one extreme and the other extremely liberal and extremely conservative. In fact, most Americans are not that. Most Americans look like this on the picture. This is what's called a normal distribution, with most Americans clustered around the middle and very few on the tails. And that actually is where Americans are in terms of like ideology. Most Americans are right around the middle. They're not extremely liberal. They're not extremely conservative. They're mostly, even on Christian nationalist ideology, they're mostly in the middle. But what has been happening over the last few decades is what is called political sorting. With political sorting, you have a pattern of social characteristics being associated with certain sides of this spectrum, right and left, certain partisan sides. So in terms of partisanship, what you have is you've got Republicans on the right, Democrats on the left, and more you have seen ideological unity moving in each of those groups. Now, what has been happening over the past few decades is that Republicans have been moving faster to the right, faster than Democrats have moved to the left. Part of this is because of greater ideological diversity. I can show you data with the, say, something we have called the General Social Survey. Within the past 10 years, basically about 60 or 2/3 of Republicans identify as politically conservative. So there is greater ideological unity there. Whereas Democrats, basically 45% of Democrats identify as politically liberal. The other 55% identify as moderate or conservative. What you have is greater ideological diversity. And Democratic Party leaders have to adjust to that greater ideological diversity in their rhetoric. They can't speak to one ideological group. They actually have to speak to multiple, whereas Republicans are a safer bet to just speak to conservatives and groups moving more extremely conservative. Also, we see the Republican Party is growing disproportionately white. They're not growing more white in absolute terms. America is diversifying, but we're becoming less white as a society, and Republicans in part are reflecting that. But Republicans are moving and becoming more diverse a lot slower than the nation is becoming more diverse. So what is saying is they're not growing more white in absolute terms, but they are growing more disproportionately white. Whereas the Democratic Party is actually becoming more diverse at a faster pace than the rest of the nation is growing diverse. And so with the Democratic Party, not only do you have greater ideological diversity, you also have increasingly disproportionate racial diversity. Republicans are disproportionately white. Lastly, Republicans with every passing decade are growing disproportionately more white Christian, especially white evangelical. About 4 in 10 Republicans are white evangelical, and about 8 in 10 Republicans are white Christians. Meanwhile, Democrats are characterized by greater religious diversity. They are comprised of black Protestants who tend to be conservative in their faith and more progressive on economic issues. They're comprised of progressive liberals and progressive Catholics and seculars who tend to be more on the left end of the spectrum. So what all of this means is that leaders on the Democratic Party, when they speak to an audience of potential Democratic voters, they have to adjust for that kind of diversity. They can't rally one racial group or one ideological group or one religious group. Republicans disproportionately, however, are not only able to speak to greater ideological unity, racial unity, and religious unity, they are increasingly rewarded for doing so, and we're actually seeing this in our political rhetoric. Studies over the past, say, several decades of how political leaders use religious rhetoric found that historically, political leaders could not use this kind of radical Christian nationalist rhetoric because they would risk alienating a lot of voters, because you would find conservative Christians in both parties. You were just as likely to be an evangelical Democrat as you were an evangelical Republican in the 1970s and early 1980s. Trends over the last few decades, however, have sorted those groups to where Republicans are increasingly speaking to white evangelical, white conservative Christians, and they know that, and everybody knows it. And so they are actually able to address that audience using explicitly Christian nationalist language. Not only Christian nationalist language, but talk that Christian groups are under attack. We saw this in 2016 in Trump's rhetoric, and you see this. Trump was actually one of the only political leaders to be able to do this kind of thing. And in fact, he stands alone in his use of explicit Christian nationalist rhetoric. And I'm just going to give you some examples. January 10, 2016, there is an assault on Christianity. There is an assault on everything we stand for. Think about the juxtaposition of phrases there. Assault on Christianity, assault on everything we stand for. Really, Christianity in this articulation is not a religion so much as a culture. It's our way of life, our values. And we are going to stop the assault. So Christianity is under attack, and we, with my leadership, we are going to fight off that attack. Later on that week, January 6, 2016, but we are going to protect Christianity. You look at the different places, and Christianity, it's under siege. Again, this talk of persecution. Other religions, frankly, they're banding together and they're using it. Somehow we've got to unify. We've got to band together. Our country has got to do that around Christianity, explicit Christian nationalist language. We have got to unite as a country around Christianity, which is currently under siege. Later on, in January 2020, this is in his second race, a society without religion cannot prosper. A nation without faith cannot endure. But because justice, goodness, and peace cannot prevail without the glory of Almighty God. I have no idea what that means at all, but I think it's explicitly referencing, at the very least, it's explicitly referencing our need to rally together around a common religious heritage. As we speak, however, these are the threats. As we speak, every Democratic candidate is trying to punish religious believers and trying to silence our churches and pastors. Our opponents want to shut out God from the public square so they can impose their extreme anti-religious and socialist agenda on America. My administration will restore the faith as the true foundation of American life. So think about the kinds of things that we're seeing juxtaposed with one another. There's the idea of our society needs religion, we need Christianity. We need to rally and build that as the foundation of our country. That's explicitly Christian nationalist. That really is the ideology. And Christianity is our way of life, the things that we value, everything that we value. But it's also talk of Christianity being under attack. It's under siege, right? And we're under threat. And the implication is that I am the president who is going to fight for you and to make sure that nobody is able to persecute Christians anymore. Well, so what we are trying to do, and this is, I think, this is where we get into experimental data again, which I'm really excited about. Over the last year, we've been collecting these experimental studies with a team of social psychologists that have co-recruited from around the country. What we're trying to do is we're trying to get to the bottom of what exactly this kind of religious threat language does. So what I think it does, because we've already shown that Christian language, talk of Christian values and Christian heritage and Christian nation, is fundamentally racialized, so that when white Americans hear talk of Christian identity, Christian values, they think white Americans like me. So what that means is, this is the hypothesis, that when a politician gets up and says Christian Americans are under attack, Christianity is under siege, there is an assault on Christianity and everything we stand for, it's possible that white Christians don't just hear Christian, they hear white. They hear people like me. They hear racial threat, which causes them to react against racial minority groups. Could that happen? Could that be the game? Could that be a strategy deployed by leaders on the far right? I'm not just talking about identifying certain Republicans, but leaders on the reactionary right to stoke threats of racial, or stoke perceptions of racial threat by using talk of anti-Christian threat. Well, I think that is what's happening, and I'll show you with experimental data. So recently we ran a similar kind of experiment. We used a group of white Christians from something called Prime Panels. Now, they weren't recruited as white Christians. This is a subsample. So in other words, there's not a self-selection thing. We didn't say, hey, if you're a white Christian, come here, we want to run an experiment on you. We just pulled this group out of the larger sample, and we had them conduct or do an experiment. What we did was we gave them a manipulation. We had them respond to one of four conditions. They either had no article to read or they had one of three articles to read. One article was an article about white Americans being discriminated against. Another article was about Christians being discriminated against. And another article was about black Americans being discriminated against. And these were factual articles. They weren't just articles like hypotheticals. These were like talk about like, hey, studies show that white Americans are getting discriminated against, Christians are discriminated against, black Americans are discriminated against. What we wanted to do is we wanted to see if we exposed these Americans to certain kinds of basically reports or rhetoric that certain groups were under attack, would it make them think about other groups being under attack based on common identity overlap like we saw in those circles? So our outcome for this is a multi-item scale of perceived prejudice against various groups, whites, Christians, and blacks, and ranging from 1 to 7. Here are the results. Now, this is where it gets kind of interesting, so you got to follow me along. Or follow along with where I'm going, and I'll try to point to exactly what I'm talking about. So we have along the side, the right axis here, we've got the conditions. So these are the conditions that they were exposed to. Control means they were given no article to read. And over here it means whether they perceived there was greater anti-Christian bias or anti-white bias. Now first, I just want to point out those who got the anti-white condition, like in other words, they were told about prejudice against white Americans. They were more likely to say that there was anti-white bias, right? That's what you would expect, because that just means our manipulation worked. Like we told them about anti-white bias, and they thought, okay, white Americans are experiencing more prejudice. Same thing with anti-Christian bias. Those who got the anti-Christian condition were more likely than the control to say, yes, Christians are being targeted for persecution. There is bias against Christians. Again, this is exactly what we expected. It just means our manipulations worked. We reported about one thing, and they said, yes, that thing is indeed happening. But notice what also happens. Those who got the anti-white condition were for some reason more likely to say that there was anti-Christian bias than the control. Do you see what I'm saying? That this group of white Christians, when we told them about anti-white bias, were more likely to say that there was also more anti-Christian bias. And look at over here. Those who got the anti-Christian condition, in other words, they were told about prejudice against Christians, were more likely to perceive that there was anti-white bias. So what I've just shown you is that even though, white Americans, white Christians in this sample, when they were told about anti-white persecution, they were more likely to think Christians are persecuted. And when they were told about anti-Christian persecution, they were more likely to think whites are persecuted. So in the minds of this sample of Americans, we actually activated racial threat by telling them about anti-Christian threat. Now, what are the implications of that? Well, if reporting threats to Christians primes perceptions of threat against whites among white Christians, then politicians and leaders on the cultural right can effectively activate or trigger racial threat in public rhetoric by only referencing anti-Christian threats. It means I never have to talk about Antifa or Black Lives Matter or immigrants or Muslims if I can just talk about how Christians are under siege, Christians are under attack, and I can make you think whites are under attack. Now think about the language that we've seen over the last, say, 6 years in politics. This is just a snippet of quotes that I've pulled from, say, Donald Trump's many speeches. And I could go on for days about these kinds of things, and I just have a catalog of these kinds of quotes that were used in public rhetoric. We are under siege. We are losing ground. Christians are losing ground in this country. We're going to protect Christianity. If you look at different Muslim minority context or Muslim majority context, Christianity is under siege. There is an assault on Christianity. We're stopping cold the attacks on Judeo-Christian values. Democrats in their relentless crusade against Christians of all faith. What is going on with that rhetoric? Well, certainly it'll make a group of white Christians feel like Christians are under attack. But I would argue it also makes them feel like white Americans are under attack from these non-white threats. All right, that becomes a cultural problem beyond just perceptions of like culture wars and political persecution towards Christians or people coming after our religious freedoms. That actually becomes a wedge that drives racial animosity. It drives racial threat, perceptions that white Americans are being targeted. Think about this picture right here. You remember this. What on earth is going on in that picture? All right, so think about this. And this picture was rightly confusing for many because at the height of the George Floyd protests, this is early June of 2020. At the height of George Floyd protests, you had people around Washington, D.C., in Lafayette Square, and there was controversy over how this happened, but Lafayette Square gets cleared. And then Trump walks out with the Secret Service, and he goes and stands in front of St. John's Episcopal Church, and he silently holds aloft a Holy Bible, a Christian Bible. And he doesn't open it, doesn't say anything about it. Somebody says, "Is that your Bible?" And he says, "It's a Bible." And he holds it up. And that's literally what he said. That's what happened. And so, and he holds it up, and he has this photo op where he just kind of holds up the Bible. Now, what is going on in that context, right? Like at the height of George Floyd protests, people are being told there are riots in the street. These are racial riots. And Trump's constituency is told there are racial riots, and they're scared. And Trump goes and holds up a Bible. What is going on? Now, I'm not accusing Trump of playing 3D chess here, that he's some kind of master manipulator and just knows exactly what's happening in terms of like triggering racial threat and response among certain groups, that he is that kind of aware of what's happening. But he was aware of what would rally white Christians who were his base to perceptions that Trump is in control, right? And it was holding aloft a Bible. And I would argue that based on our experimental data and the kinds of things that we're seeing about Christian nationalist language being fundamentally racialized language, that to have a president go up in the middle of this racial protest and hold aloft a Bible not only signals religious leadership and religious protection, but it signals racial leadership, racial protection. We actually see this in our survey data that white Christian Americans, or white Americans who subscribe to Christian nationalism, we're actually likely to perceive Trump in this way, as the protector of white Christians. So before the 2020 election, we asked Americans basically hypothetical questions. So we asked them, how much discrimination are whites and Christians experiencing now? How much discrimination will whites and Christians experience if Biden wins? And how much discrimination will whites and Christians experience if Trump wins? Now notice the middle line first. This is how much they're experiencing now, or basically whether they think they're experiencing a lot of discrimination now. And unsurprisingly, we find that as white Americans increase in Christian nationalism, they were more likely to say whites and Christians are experiencing a lot of discrimination now. What about if Trump wins? We see this blacked up. They were going to experience less discrimination. So Trump is realistically going to stop the persecution of whites and Christians. What happens if Biden wins? Whew. Look at that. The perception that if Biden was going to win, like look at how serious that perceived threat is against whites and Christians. If Biden, under a Biden presidency, really feeling like this is imminent persecution facing people like us, right? As Christian nationalism increases, they were more likely to say that persecution against whites and Christians is almost a certainty in a Biden presidency versus a Trump presidency, which would free us from that kind of persecution. But this isn't just about Trump's rhetoric. Think about this. This actually exposes this connection between white Christian nationalist language triggering perceptions of racial threat and racial animosity and potentially racial division. Actually exposes what's going on in what I would call the entire Christian nationalism industrial complex. There is actually an entire industry that exists on the basis of being able to convince enough white Christian Americans that the nation is for Christians, for people like us, essentially. What I have over here is the Patriots Bible. That is actually, the Patriots Bible comes in multiple forms now. You can get the Patriots Bible for teens. You can get the Patriots Bible for women, which assumes kind of weirdly that this is the Patriots Bible for men, I guess. But this is the Patriots Bible for men. There's a Patriots Bible for women. And then there's something called the Founders Bible put together by a guy named David Barton who works for an organization called Wall Builders, which exists to provide that kind of like information, rhetoric, and detail for Americans, for pastors, basically to articulate this vision of America as a Christian nation, has always been, should always be. And by the way, if you ever get a hold of the Founders Bible, it is a wonder to behold. As somebody who considers himself a sort of a sommelier of Christian nationalism, a fine Christian nationalism, it is chef's kiss. It is the epitome. It makes the American Patriots Bible look like the secular humanist Bible. Like it is that serious. It is every other page some story about America's connection with Christianity and how the Bible is was the basis for all of these documents and all of these leaders and all those kinds of things. And that is something that you can purchase and that you can pass around and that you can use to help other white Christians understand that this is what a nation, America has always been about, and this is what it should be for. But there are also things. There are multimedia projects. There's something called the Truth Project that was put together by Focus on the Family. This is something that Mike Huckabee has been pushing recently. I get these emails, and I actually ordered this. You could get it free. It's a kids program. It's a kids cartoon program that will tell your children about America's Christian heritage, and apparently all of these guys. And, I think that is Thomas Jefferson, and I doubt Thomas Jefferson would have been in this spot, Benjamin Franklin as well. But you see some others as well, Martin Luther King Jr. up in there. I think I see Kennedy in the back, and you got Reagan. I'm not sure who that guy is over there. Anyways, this is a cartoon that you can show your kids. You've got video series, multimedia platforms. You've got Wall Builders, American Family Radio, and you've got an entire entire genre on Amazon of scores and scores of books that can tell you all about the threat to Christian America, that the persecution Christians are experiencing, that no longer able to say Merry Christmas. Did you know that? That the very freedom is under attack. And so you will be told all about the threats that Christian Americans are experiencing. What I would argue and what I believe is going on. And here I'll just sum up what we're showing thus far. Christian nationalism is something that is racialized. It is not something that we can talk about in generic terms. It is fundamentally racialized, and among white Americans, it seems to provoke the idea that America is a nation that is founded by us for people like us. And it seems to incline white Americans in particular toward attitudes that I would consider authoritarian and prone to authoritarian violence, or at the very least supportive of authoritarian violence to control problem populations. It is anti-democratic. It seems to support the idea that only the worthy few should be able to participate in democracy, that voting is a privilege and not a right that shall not be infringed, but it is rather something that we can take away. It is prone to conspiratorial belief. Everything from QAnon conspiracy to the belief that Donald Trump had the election stolen nearly a year after that has been debunked 7 ways to Sunday. And it seems to be highly associated with the idea that imminent political violence is on the horizon. But not only that, I believe the rhetoric that we're seeing among politicians that is rewarded. Increasingly, in our polarized society, this kind of rhetoric is rewarded. That is actually continuing to stoke these kinds of, I think, ideologies. Not only Christian nationalist rhetoric, but the talk of anti-Christian persecution that, as I am showing tonight, is actually associated with perceptions of anti-white persecution. So it is not only just a religion story, it is also a story about racial and ethnic division that is continually stoked by political rhetoric and by Christian nationalist ideology. So I believe there are lots of different ways to study this, and we have lots of other questions that we want to ask empirically about this phenomenon, but there's lots of questions that might need to be answered. And so I would love to hear any questions that you might have about the research that we have ongoing, or if I presented something that wasn't clear here tonight, I'd be happy to answer that question. Or if you just have a question out of left field about this particular topic, I'd love to hear that. Thank you for allowing me to share some time.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Perry. I know these are waters that we have all been swimming in for a number of years now, and we've become more and more aware of the waters as time has gone on. So this has been a snapshot of Dr. Perry's research. There's probably times during the presentation where you said, well, but what about this or what about that? But I can almost guarantee you that there is a paper that's been written on this and that. So now's a chance to check in on those things. We have, I think, about 25 minutes or so. Great. We've got a great house here. So I'm going to be bringing the mic around for any kind of questions. So I'll just bring it to you if you want to raise your hand, and we'll hear your question and proceed for about 25 minutes.
Is there any data at this point on how it's been affecting evangelism and the growth of the Christian church when these are the loudest voices representing the Christian faith?
Yes, absolutely. It's completely harmful. This is something that has been documented for the past 2 decades, so that is an excellent question. I swear I didn't plant this. That question is actually one of the most serious questions that I think we are facing as the church, because since around 2000, and this has been demonstrated both in survey data and in experimental data, but we have found that young people especially are reacting to what they perceive to be the radically reactionary views of the Christian right. And I don't mean like this is not people reacting to just kind of the gospel. This is not reacting to the gospel message, to Jesus' teaching. This is reacting to the perception of Christian identity being so wrapped up with reactionary conservative politics that they feel like if that is what being a Christian is all about, then count me out. And you have people leaving in response to this. This is legitimately demonstrated by scores of social scientists. It is something that is incontrovertible at this point, that this is taking place, where you have an abdication of faith. That is, people just saying, you know what, call me nothing. Call me a nun. Call me unaffiliated. If this is what it means to be a Christian, then I want no part of this kind of thing. The answer isn't to be like, hey, let's just get rid of, let's just tone down the Jesus talk, because this isn't really Jesus talk. This is culture war talk. This is us versus them politics, and kind of taking back our country and fighting the libs, and like this kind of rhetoric that really doesn't have anything to do with kind of authentic gospel witness. That is something I wouldn't want Christians to shrink back from at all, in the slightest. And yet, I think what we are seeing is we're seeing, especially among young people, we're seeing a reaction to Christian nationalism that is leading people away from the faith, not back to the faith. Does that make sense? Yeah, so that is something that is absolutely happening. And it is, you've got to, I'm on social media a lot, and you've got to understand how poor a witness this kind of rhetoric has been, and how much of just a disaster it has been for the witness of the church in the history. When we're all in heaven one day and we're kind of looking back on what was just the most toxic and unhelpful phenomenon of our various years and eras of the Christian kind of era. I got to think Christians' behavior on social media and the rhetoric that has been deployed over the last, say, 10 years will be up there, because it's just sullied the church's reputation like no other thing. But in other ways, not just in the political arena, but in the rhetoric that gets thrown around, I think. Yeah.
So you mentioned earlier on that most people thankfully end up in the middle on your survey of white Christian nationalism. So the people we're talking about here that have the more radical views are in the minority. So how large is this minority? How worried, how pervasive is this problem?
Yeah, that's exactly. Great question. So in our first book, Taking America Back for God, what we do is we try to quantify what are the size of these groups. And we divide Americans into 4 categories, from left to right. We call them rejectors, that is people who completely reject Christian nationalism, resistors, accommodators, and ambassadors. Ambassadors are that true believer category. And statistically speaking, we're talking about people like, if you can divide them up into quartiles. In that top quartile, we have ambassadors, and they represent maybe a fifth of the population in that extreme. And then rejectors on the far end, we have another fifth, right? So like 60% of Americans are right in that middle. And actually, the largest group is what we call accommodators. That's a plurality, and so about a third of Americans are in that accommodator category. They're a little bit above average in their score on the Christian nationalism scale, but that doesn't mean they're like hardcore Christian nationalists. I think a lot of people misunderstand that. They're like, above average means you are also a Christian nationalist. Again, I don't use that language, but like above average just means that you're probably a Christian, you probably think Christian values are a good thing, you probably think religious symbols are fine, that doesn't threaten you. You're not comfortable with like no separation of church and state. You're not comfortable with like institutionally saying America is a Christian nation. That's not something that you feel like is a good thing. And yet, most Americans are kind of in this friendly category. And that means like, I was talking to the faculty earlier about this, actually, or I was talking to a group of students in a class earlier, excuse me. I actually think ambassadors of Christian nationalism are really true believers, and they're actually really tough to convince otherwise, and it certainly won't be the sociologist in the room who does that kind of thing. I would think shields would be up already. But we have found that people who score in that accommodator category, like that third, that like where a lot of Americans end up living, Christian Americans especially, we find they're actually quite amenable to kind of like saying, hey, this is probably not something that you want to go further down towards. This is something that you don't want to affirm in the strongest possible terms, because we think it's associated with a lot of unfortunate negative, kind of attitudes and behaviors. And so if that gives you an idea of the size of that population, I think most Americans are above the average, but not in a way that makes them like hardcore Christian nationalists at all.
Yeah, so I just have a question about the experimental study you did on a sample of white Christians, and the question about different identities being true American, like white and true American, Muslim, that kind of stuff. Was there anyone who responded that all of those identities are true American in your results?
Well, that's a good question. Not that I know of. We are just looking at those aggregate patterns, and I think the strength of that study is really in the aggregate. So like we are going to do that study, we're going to replicate that study with larger numbers so that we can be more confident that like what we found is really a pattern that we feel like we can replicate and see over and over again. I would suggest that person would be probably an extreme outlier in terms of these data. That probably just didn't happen most often. But that's a good question. I just don't know off the top of my head.
Over in this corner.
We have one over there, right there. Oh, sorry. I'm trying to get you.
Sorry.
That's it. Sorry, this is right there.
Dr. Perry, are you able to go back to your slide?
Sure. Which one?
The one of Trump standing with the Bible in front of the church.
There you go.
And I just have this simple question. I'm curious if in the Westmont community people realize what they can't see on there. Rector, which is a term for Episcopal head priest at the church. If the students are aware of the head priest at St. John's at that point in time was a gentleman who was raised from here in Carpinteria his whole life. Was very active in Los Angeles Episcopal Church, went on to Yale, and of course that day he had absolutely no pre-contact with anyone, including the Secret Service, that this was going to happen. And the fallout in his life from everything that happened is a story unto itself. I was just curious if people knew he was a local kid.
Did not know that. And I actually didn't know did he take heat after that? Oh, that's unfortunate.
It just got so messy.
Yeah.
So complicated.
Well, I can imagine people directing, how unfortunate that people would direct anger towards him for that.
I was just wondering the level of education among the ambassador category.
Yeah, so we find education is negatively associated usually with it's not the most powerful predictor of whether or not you subscribe to Christian nationalism are things like biblical literalism, like you take a more fundamentalist approach Oftentimes it's the use of prophecy, like you believe in a literal rapture, literal Armageddon, that you believe in literal, all things. And not that like believing those things are literal like makes you a Christian nationalist. I just mean oftentimes it's not these like demographic factors. It's more often kind of theological and political beliefs. But education is negatively associated with adhering to Christian nationalist ideology. So Americans who are college educated, graduate educated, are less likely to hold to it.
We have one right down here.
Hey,
I was just curious if the information was public to look at, all the stuff that you're talking about.
Some of it is published in the new book. So like a lot of this was taken from that. Some of it is from data that we just recently collected. So it's not public yet. You're getting some of the ground floor level stuff. The experimental things are still like in progress. So like what I showed you was experimental data from like our preliminary studies that we are now revising hypotheses, so we can do something called pre-registration. So we pre-register those studies so that we actually show like, hey, here are the hypotheses we expect. We're going to collect this data and we're going to publish the findings and kind of hold us to account for that. Yeah. So not quite. Hey.
So some of the correlations that you showed kind of go back a long time in American history with guns and control, and this kind of looks familiar from early parts of our country. But like the one about COVID, how did that come to function as a marker of Christian nationalism? It seems like we take it for granted now, but there's no reason why that, associated with all the other sort of trends that you looked at, should necessarily be associated with Christian nationalism, or Christian nationalism. So do you have any sense about how that came to be, or how it's functioning, or why it's functioning that way?
Right. So this actually goes along with something I was talking about earlier in one of the groups. I think it was we were talking to one of Mary's classes, and we were talking with students in kind of information silos. And so what we're actually seeing, and we have. So I'm actually. Oh gosh, do I have? I don't have it on. Do I have it on these data? No, I don't have it on these data. I'm sorry. I was just thinking I may be able to pull it up. So we actually, and I'm proud to say, I was sharing this with some faculty earlier. One of the things we're proud to say over the last year is we actually just submitted a report to the January 6th committee. So a lot of our research on Christian nationalism, they wanted to know. The House of Representatives wanted to know what was the role of Christian nationalism in it. We all saw all the religious symbols amidst the violence, and so they were kind of, what is the role of Christian nationalism in that morass of like symbols and chaos and disorder? And one of the things that we talk about in that report is that we can document how Christian nationalism is strongly associated with what we call information silos. We're only getting information from certain sources. And so one of the charts that we show in that data, in that report, is that Christian nationalism, that group we call ambassadors, that group that scores the highest, and it's the highest quartile. We show that if we give them a list of people that they trust in terms of the media, what kind of media sources they trust, all of the news channels, all of the newspapers, and that kind of thing, they basically have no trust in any news source at all except for like Fox News. And the second highest is Breitbart. And we didn't in that study, we didn't ask about like OAN or Newsmax or those kinds of sources. So what we're finding is that these Americans are only getting their information about everything from the election to COVID from certain sources. They distrust all other sources. So what we see in there is kind of an anti-elite populism, right? Like they only trust certain kind of like tribally loyal news sources. That includes Trump, that includes Fox News, that includes to some degree Breitbart. If we had asked them about radio stations, I'm sure it would have been like American Family Radio or something like that. And so COVID vaccine, or COVID belief that, and I have other data on this kind of things, like belief that the government is hiding what it knows about the origins of the COVID-19 virus, or that COVID vaccines they don't believe are safe and effective in stopping COVID. COVID vaccines themselves can cause deaths. These are often associated with certain information silos. They only get information from very conspiratorial sources, or sources that would already be predisposed to distrusting the media, the scientists, the medical experts, and that kind of thing. And so I think that's what we're seeing. It's not necessarily Christian nationalism has this kind of theological connection to like anti-COVID or COVID conspiracy. It's through distrust in every other elite source, only trust in certain kind of information. Does that make sense? Okay.
One more here, and then we'll move to this side of the room after this question.
Yeah, I was wondering if we know why these people think this way, or like how people come to start thinking this way. So I don't think anyone is really born with like these super extreme views.
Right.
So how did that kind of work its way into that community, if that makes sense?
Yeah, sure. It's a combination of several different things we do find. I mean, there's a sense in which, like, as I was showing here, there's an industry, right, like that is set up and built around this narrative of like socializing everybody from young people to old people in this kind of narrative of Christian nationalist history and ideology. And so, to some degree, there's an industry that's out there to kind of educate people in this way. And churches participate in that to the extent that they use these kinds of materials. In terms of like long-term trends, though, we're actually finding that Christian nationalism isn't just a result of this, but Christian nationalism is actually a response to perceptions of threat. So in other words, when we tell, and this is again another experimental design by one of my co-authors, we find that when we tell a white Christian audience that say like Christians are going to be the minority in 2040 or something like that, they respond to that news of like their diminishing demographic status with greater Christian nationalism. In other words, like when you perceive that like I'm going to be the minority, I'm going to be in the threat, then you start to kind of rally around this idea that like, okay, we need to band together, we need to recognize our Christian heritage, we need to remember that we're important, that we have this role to play. And so Christian nationalism ebbs and flows throughout our nation's history. White Christian nationalism especially ebbs and flows throughout our nation's history in response to perceptions of like majority group threat. And so certain like white Christian majorities feel threatened by, say, political realities or demographic transitions or cultural transitions. They respond and react with that kind of thought pattern. Does that make sense? Okay, so yeah, both the socialization angle, but also it is a response to very real realities. Like our demography is changing in the United States. Like our demographic makeup, our secularization is slowly moving in some ways throughout the United States, especially among young people. And that perception could breed a Christian nationalist threat response. Yeah. Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
We're trying to move to the opposite. Sorry.
Well, we'll go over here.
I tried.
So my question is, so in your research, you must have had a lot of time to converse with people who subscribe to this ideology. And as young Christian scholars, do you have any advice in engaging in an open dialogue that is constructive with people who subscribe to this ideology?
Yeah, so I mean, that really is, and I wish I had ended with that, honestly. Like, I think that was probably a more important kind of point. So I'm glad you brought that up, like, just to kind of what is the next step, so that we don't just get into really, really sad news. What is the way that we move forward these kinds of conversations? One of them is by not calling people Christian nationalists, which I explicitly try to avoid. But more seriously, I think it is by not playing into the polarization game, and that is like not seeing Americans as enemies and us and them, and a fight to the death between like, oh, look at those backwards people who just kind of believe these weird things. But by realizing that what I'm fighting against is, I think, an ideology that I think takes hold of people and I think influences a lot of negative and uninformed and kind of potentially toxic views that people can be disabused of, that people can be talked to. I do believe most Americans are at the personal level able to engage in a conversation. That if it doesn't start off in a combative way, that we can actually bridge those gaps in a way. You all probably have relationships with people that like maybe embrace a lot of the things that I'm talking about, maybe in your families. Probably a lot of them in your families, or at least your neighbors, or people that you love in your churches. I do too. And so I commit to loving those people. And I commit to loving them where they're at. If they commit to loving me where I'm at, you know what I mean? And not if, I don't mean like an if then, but I just mean like, the part of my deal is by saying I accept that we disagree on these kinds of things and I will love you, and let me tell you why I disagree on those things. And I ask you to love me, and let's build a relationship around our common bond as Christ followers and as people who want to live out this mission in obedience. What I try to do is I want to explain to Christian Americans why this is not just something that is harmful to democracy, but it's harmful to Christianity. It's harmful for Christian witness. It's harmful for our own commitment to love God and love our neighbor as ourselves. Because it's really difficult to hold to this kind of ideology and love people who are different from you. Because this really sets us up as Americans and us versus them, constantly paranoid, constantly talking about persecution. It is also, and this is something I haven't demonstrated experimentally, but I believe anecdotally, I think Christian nationalism is fundamentally antithetical to the cross. Because Christian nationalism doesn't have a category for losing. It doesn't have a category for like self-sacrifice. It only wins. It conquers. It speaks in terms of victory because culture wars must be won. You don't lose culture wars so that you can win again. Right? Like there's no last shall be first in Christian nationalism. It is the first shall be first. And really that is the ideology. And so I believe that is un-Christian. Right? I believe that displays a lack of faith in the gospel. Our identity as like citizens of another country. So I think I want to convince Christians that this is something that is not just toxic to American democracy, but toxic to their own faith.
We have about 10 minutes left, so we'll do about 3 or 4 more questions.
So I'm wondering about, is it Christian nationalism or religious nationalism? So thinking in the world context where Hindu nationalism in India has also had this huge peak. So I'm wondering if it's unique to Christianity, or in what ways it's unique to Christianity. And if it's not, if it's about religious nationalism, what is it that you think is about the fusion between those two that bubbles up in this way?
So, what a great perspective. So I think what we are seeing in the rise of white Christian nationalism in the United States is reflective of global patterns. And so we are actually seeing a rise, what you might call religious nationalism, but even broader than religious nationalism, what's called a brand of like authoritarian ethno-traditionalism that's associated with like populist rhetoric and populist ethno-nationalism. Right? So like those are fancy words, but what I just mean is like you've got rising a group of people across the world in different nations and in different religions that are saying, hey, we like it better under an old, basically an ethno-cultural tradition, and they're willing to enforce that with authoritarian means. We certainly see that in white Christian nationalism in the United States. We also see that, say, in the Lutheran movement in India. We see that in Bolsonaro's Brazil. We see that in Orban's Hungary. We see that in other, Putin's Russia, right? We see this in all kinds of other nations. So there's a sense in which what we're seeing in white Christian nationalism is spanning across countries on a global scale. I don't think what we're witnessing is specific to Christianity per se, because I don't think Christianity at this point is really the point. Not in Christian nationalism. You know what I'm saying? Like, Christianity is, as I've been trying to explain, it just doubles as code language for people like us, our people, the old ways, our way of life, and that is an ethnoculture. And that's really actually the language I'm really comfortable using. Like it is in a very real way, we don't really speak of we don't have to speak of a Christian right anymore so much as a pro-Christian right? Like it doesn't even matter if you're a Christian so much anymore, because we're actually finding statistically that a lot of non-Christian Americans, secular Americans even, subscribe to Christian nationalist ideology. What's going on there? Well, it is because if you are a white American, the label Christian or the language of Christianity can just fill in a gap as just ethnoculture. You want Christian ethnoculture, conservative, traditional values, our kind of values, our kind of people. You want them to be empowered, you want our cultural influence to be the hegemon, right? Like you want it to be kind of dominant. So we see that in other countries, we certainly see that in the United States. I do believe this is part of a broader story. Now, I think in the American context, it's unique because of our unique history with this kind of evangelical religion. We have this language that is built up around this apparatus. And our country does have this unique story with Christianity. In some ways very secular, but in some ways very tied to religion. And so it's this kind of unique manifestation in the United States. But you can talk about it as a broader religious nationalism, but I would use language that's even broader than that to talk about kind of the authoritarian nationalist tendencies that we see. Does that make sense? Okay.
I was wondering if there's anything that Christians could do now to kind of help clarify or reframe
what like toxic Christians have led non-Christians to believe Christianity is.
All right. I think being an authentic witness yourself, not walking away from the faith as not walking away from the faith saying, hey, if this is what religion is going to be, if this is what Christianity is going to be, count me out. I think that really ultimately ends up ceding ground to the people that you would rather not represent Christianity to the rest of the world. I certainly don't want to do that. I want to present an expression of Christianity that is winsome and loving and other-centered, and not me versus the world, but me for the world. Right? I want to be like, if you want to embody your faith in a Christ-like way, I've got to think that has got to be embodied by self-sacrifice. It's got to be embodied by sacrificial love and by service. And I mean like a radical love that is willing to lay down something on the basis of others being able to live and to learn about what you love. And it doesn't come through conquering them and making sure that it doesn't mean that there's not a place to take a political stand. I'm not saying that. So please don't read from me that this sociologist professor says Christians should get out of politics, that we shouldn't vote our values, we shouldn't stand on moral principles and that kind of thing. There's a place for that. And yet it all has to be communicated with the knowledge that we are witnesses. Something about Christian nationalism doesn't just abandon the cross, but it also abandons this idea of a public witness. Because why would you want to care what godless leftists think about you? They already hate you, so you hate them. So just duke it out with them to the death, right? That is kind of this us versus them mentality. They have to be conquered. They don't have to be died for. That is unchristian, right? That is not a way. Jesus died for them too. And so I would argue that I want authentic Christianity to be the kind of thing that we say. Jesus died for Pharisees, and he died for prodigal sons, and he died for Christian nationalists. And I extend my life and my love to them as well to try to help them understand what's going on and why this is harmful. But yeah, it's got to be something where we get rid of the us versus them kind of dichotomy that we see. And I think really that is one of the first signs that you kind of bought into culture war and Christian nationalism. You start to look around the world disgusted and say, these freaking people, I can't believe, I've got to put up with their immorality and their, whatever. This country would be so great without all these non-Christians. And so, I think that's a bad route to walk there.
I think that's actually a great question to finish on. So join me in thanking Dr. Barrett for being here.